Before you listen to this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on the bell icon, because what you're about to hear isn't just about betrayal, it's about revenge born from silence. This is the story of Elena Mercer, a girl whose family betrayed her in ways that would haunt anyone for life. But they made one mistake: they left her alive. And now she's back not for reconciliation, but for reckoning. Elena Mercer hadn't heard from anyone in the Mercer family since the night they dragged her out of the estate barefoot and sobbing. A 17-year-old girl accused of a crime she didn't commit, her screams ignored, her innocence buried under the lies of the people she once called family. And now, 11 years later, she stood in the marble lobby of Whitmore and Daniels Legal Group, holding a letter sealed in blood-red wax that read, "To the forgotten daughter of Gregory Mercer, a letter she was never meant to receive." She'd spent a decade rebuilding herself from ash-working double shifts in a dirty diner, sleeping in shelters, changing her last name, and clawing her way through a criminal justice degree not to escape her past, but to understand it, dissect it, weaponize it. Because Elena never forgot what they did, how her uncle framed her for theft, how her cousin Ivy planted the watch in her room, how her stepmother wept crocodile tears while her father looked her in the eye and said, "You're no daughter of mine," and turned his back forever. They thought they erased her, but she watched from afar as they flaunted their luxury, their charity galas, their magazine features, like their empire wasn't built on betrayal. And now, out of nowhere, Gregory Mercer was dead, and the will didn't just include her. It named her primary heir, executor, and controller of all Mercer holdings. No one saw it coming. To Ivy, not Uncle Reese, not the lawyers, and Elena could already hear the panic brewing in their cocktail lounges and boardrooms. But what they didn't know was that this wasn't luck, it was planned, down to the second, because Elena had uncovered something years ago: a second will, a video recording, and a confession letter her father wrote days before his death, truth about everything they buried. And now, with the keys to the estate in one hand and their secrets in the other, Elena wasn't here for money, forgiveness, or reunion. She was here to destroy every lie they ever lived behind, and this time, they wouldn't see it coming until it was far too late. The Mercer estate loomed just as Elena remembered it, cold, arrogant, and perched atop the Sylar cliffs like it had always believed itself too important to fall, its iron gates now creaking open to let in the very ghost it helped create. And as her heels clicked across the stone path her feet once bled on, memories flooded her like knives. The night she screamed from the cellar, the broken jewelry box they blamed her for, the bruises no one asked about, the silence of a father who chose image over blood. But she wasn't the scared girl anymore. She was Elena Mercer, J.D., executor of the will, holder of the keys to every drawer, safe, and lie this house was built upon. And when she walked into the grand hall wearing the black coat she bought just for this day, she found them all waiting. Uncle Reese, hiding his rage behind bourbon breath. Ivy, now a socialite influencer who once laughed while Elena sobbed in the rain. And Lydia, the stepmother who married Gregory 2 months after Elena's mother died under suspicious medical circumstances, all seated like royalty, ready to hear the reading of a will they believed would feed their greed, and the look on their faces when the lawyer cleared his throat and said, "Gregory Mercer's estate, valued at $96.4 million, is hereby left entirely to his daughter Elena. Rain Mercer," was exactly the kind of justice that tasted like fire and frost all at once. Ivy choked on her wine, Reese shouted, "Objection!" And Lydia turned ghost pale, already reaching for her lawyer's hand, but it was done. The estate, the funds, the board seats, the beach house in Capri, all of it was Elena's now. And they couldn't stop it, because Gregory had signed and notarized everything on camera, including the final confession she now kept in her briefcase, a video where he admitted to being manipulated, threatened, and drugged by his own brother and wife into disowning his daughter, and that if anything happened to him, check the locked basement drawer behind the war medals. That's where the truth is buried. So Elena stood there in silence as the vultures swirled, calm like a storm about to choose which city to destroy first. And when Ivy lunged across the table, screaming, "You don't deserve it, and why of this?" Elena simply blinked and replied, "Neither did my mother. And yet you all took everything from her." That night, after the dust of their outrage had settled, she entered her childhood room, untouched and sterile like a crime scene, and opened the floorboard under the bed, still there, still safe. The flash drive her mother had once pressed into her hand the night before she died, whispering, "If they ever turn on you, use this. It'll burn them to the ground." And as the screen loaded decades-old video footage, forged documents, and one single name repeated in every file, Reese Mercer, the orchestrator of it all, Elena leaned back, stared at the screen, and smiled for the first time in years, because now the truth wasn't just hers. It was evidence. Elena didn't sleep that night. She couldn't, not with the weight of what she had uncovered, not with the names, dates, and audio recordings that confirmed what she had only suspected as a teenager, that her mother's death wasn't a tragedy, it was a setup. A slow, deliberate poisoning orchestrated by Reese Mercer and Lydia to clear the path for marriage, control, and full inheritance rights, and that the theft Elena was framed for at 17 was never about jewelry, it was about silencing the only one who had seen Lydia sneak into Gregory's private medicine cabinet days before her mother collapsed at the dinner table. The files were buried deep hidden in folders marked as legal correspondence, health insurance statements, and fake invoices, but Elena, now trained in law and sharpened by survival, sifted through every forged signature, every manipulated date stamp, and every financial trail that led directly to a secret bank account in Switzerland under Lydia's name, with transfers that began a week after her mother's funeral and continued for a decade. It was all here, recorded conversations between Reese and Lydia, full of hushed threats, mocking laughter, and one moment where Reese said, "If the girl ever comes back, make sure she regrets it." But she didn't regret coming back, not anymore, because now she had the power to not just destroy them privately, but publicly. The next morning, she made 4 copies of the files, one for her lawyer, one for a federal prosecutor, one locked in a cloud server with facial recognition access only, and one placed silently inside Ivy's designer purse during brunch, because if Elena knew anything about Ivy, it was that her fear always turned her sloppy, and within hours, Ivy would be panicking, calling Reese, and Lydia would be scrambling to cover tracks that were already exposed. And when Ivy did exactly that, calling from the garden terrace with her voice shaking, saying, "Uncle Reese, we have a problem. She knows everything." Elena stood by the curtain, listening, calm, cold, smiling, and when they hung up, she walked into the room and whispered, "No, Ivy, you have a problem. I have proof." That night, the family gathered in the drawing room thinking they could intimidate her, threaten her, pay her off, manipulate her into giving up control, but Elena walked in wearing her mother's old emerald ring and dropped a USB drive on the mahogany table like a bomb, leaned forward and said, "That's the full history of your sins. The originals are with law enforcement. So here's what's going to happen." And what followed wasn't a scream, a fight, or a breakdown. It was the sound of power shifting, of silence dying, of a girl they discarded rising with every weapon they taught her to use, and this time no one interrupted her when she spoke. The room was silent except for the slow hum of the antique wall clock ticking behind Elena as she stood like a storm dressed in calm, facing the 3 people who had once shattered her and now watched her with trembling jaws and forced smirks. Reese, pretending to hold power with his blazer buttoned too tight, Lydia faking tears with trembling fingers and smeared mascara, and Ivy shifting like a cornered animal who finally realized her designer shoes couldn't outrun guilt. And as Elena pressed play on the tiny USB speaker, the room filled with Lydia's voice from 11 years ago saying, "He'll never question the autopsy if I use his own signature," followed by Reese laughing, "And if Elena opens her mouth, we bury her in paperwork so deep she'll never see daylight again." And when it ended, no one said a word because there was nothing left to deny. And Elena, who once begged them to believe her, to protect her, to love her, now gave no one the mercy of forgiveness. She opened the envelope from her lawyer and laid 3 documents in front of them: an affidavit for criminal prosecution, a full confession from Gregory Mercer notarized before his death, and a resignation clause that stripped Reese and Lydia of all legal ties to Mercer Holdings, with a final note: sign or be arrested. Ivy, whose face had drained to bone white, whispered, "You wouldn't actually destroy this family." And Elena looked her dead in the eye and said, "You destroyed it the moment you helped frame me. I'm just collecting the ashes." Reese tried to bluff, threatened to call in his legal team, until Elena slid a photo across the table of him and a minor he paid off to keep silent years ago, a case buried by Mercer's influence and now resurrected by Elena's connections, and Reese's hand visibly shook as he reached for the pen and signed. Lydia didn't protest, she just sobbed, but Elena didn't flinch, because fake tears had no power here anymore. And Ivy, torn between Fear and self-preservation begged Elena for a private moment, took her aside into the hallway and said, "I was 17. I didn't know what they were doing to your mother. I was scared." But Elena's reply was cold. "You weren't scared when you let them frame me. You were proud." That night, Elena had full control not just of the company, not just the estate, but of the legacy they tried to erase her from. And as she stood in her father's old office, lit only by moonlight, she opened the final drawer Gregory had once locked with the code EM20, her initials and age the year he betrayed her, and inside was a letter, handwritten and shaking. "If you're reading this, it means I'm dead. I'm sorry for not protecting you. They threatened to ruin everything. I was weak. But you're the one who'll burn them clean. I've left everything for you because you were always the one with fire in her blood." And for the first time in years, Elena cried not because she forgave him, but because even cowards can sometimes leave behind the right tools for a warrior. Elena had won, but winning wasn't the same as being finished. Not when the scars on her skin still pulsed every time she touched the walls of the estate. Not when every corridor still echoed with the memory of slammed doors, shouted lies, and whispered threats from people who once smiled during family portraits. No, her revenge wasn't complete not until every last secret they built their wealth on was dragged into the daylight. And she didn't want just retribution, she wanted erasure of their name, their respect, their legacy, and that meant moving beyond the will, beyond the walls of Mercer Estate, and into the companies, trusts, and offshore accounts they thought she'd never find. Using passwords Gregory left behind and encryption keys hidden in the lining of his old chessboard, Elena accessed layers of financial records that proved Reese had laundered Mercer funds through fake charities, and Lydia had embezzled millions through shell companies and Monaco, evidence not just of betrayal, but of federal crimes, and instead of leaking them to authorities immediately, she made them public first, timing it with a Mercer Gala livestream, hacking the projector with a quiet nod to the AV tech she paid off. So that just as Reese stood before the room trying to reclaim his relevance with a speech about Mercer tradition, the screen behind him flashed open documents, invoices, forged checks, audio files, and photos his mistress, Lydia's fake charity ledgers, the offshore vault locations, and the room exploded in gasps, cell phone flashes, and murmurs that would go viral in under 10 minutes. Chaos followed, board members resigning live on Twitter, the Mercer stock dropping in real time, news anchors showing up at the gates within the hour. But Elena didn't panic. She sat alone in her father's study, sipping tea, listening to the same news networks that once ignored her story now say her name with awe and fear. Elena Mercer, the disinherited daughter turned legal heir, has revealed a scandal that could dismantle one of the most powerful dynasties on the East Coast. Ivy called twice, then texted, "You've made your point. Please stop." But Elena didn't even open it because this wasn't about a point, it was about restoration, about justice, about dragging every nail they used to build their empire out with her own bare hands and melting it into a nameplate that now sat on her desk, CEO, Elena R. Mercer. And yet, beneath all the triumph, something lingered, a file marked Project Raven, locked with a separate password tucked deep in the system, untraceable unless you knew where to look, and Elena paused because Raven wasn't a Mercer name. It was her mother's maiden name, and suddenly she realized this went further than just greed and betrayal. There was something else buried here, something even Gregory hadn't wanted to speak aloud in his final letter, and now Elena knew. The real war hadn't even started yet. It took Elena 3 hours, 2 encryption breakers, and a code hidden in the margins of her mother's old journals to open the file labeled Project Raven, and when it unlocked, her breath stopped not because of what was there, but because of what it meant. The file was a mix of scanned medical reports, psychiatric evaluations, private DNA tests, handwritten letters between Gregory and a lawyer she'd never heard of, and one faded photograph of a man she didn't recognize, but her mother had written on the back in red ink, "The truth is uglier than betrayal. Protect her." And at first Elena didn't understand, until she saw the DNA result marked confidential, not biologically, Gregory's, and realized with a jolt that her father had known all along Elena wasn't his. Her mother had lied for 17 years, and Gregory had found out just weeks before her death. But instead of confronting her, he had launched Project Raven, a secret investigation into her mother's past, complete with interviews, surveillance, and threats, all funded under fake Mercer R&D expenses. Her real father's name was Vincent Lorne, a powerful hedge fund criminal who had faked his death in 1996 to avoid federal indictment, and had once been in love with Elena's mother before she walked away and vanished, pregnant and scared, into Gregory's arms. Elena staggered back, shaking, not because she felt betrayed, but because she realized that the family she had just burned to the ground might not have been her enemy at all, not originally, and that her mother's death may have had less to do with Mercer greed and more to do with who might have been looking for Elena all along. Suddenly it made sense: the forged autopsy, the closed casket, the sealed court files, and the deeper she went into Project Raven, the more terrified she became. There were records of wire transfers sent to someone labeled Agent VL just days after her mother's funeral, coordinates for a private airstrip used on the same night, and a one-line note from Gregory's final week alive: "If she ever finds this, I failed. Vincent is alive." And that name, Vincent Lorne, was still listed as missing, presumed dead by the FBI. But the Mercer private investigator Gregory hired had tracked sightings of him in Prague, London, and most recently Toronto. Suddenly, Elena felt like the chessboard had flipped. She wasn't the queen. She was still the pawn, and the game wasn't over. It had just moved into a darker dimension. She wasn't just the daughter of betrayal anymore. She was the secret both families had tried to bury for different reasons. And if Vincent Lorne really was alive and had just found out the Mercer estate now belonged to his daughter, he'd come looking and he wouldn't knock. For the first time since she returned, Elena didn't feel victorious. She felt hunted. Elena didn't pack a bag. She packed vault documents, encrypted drives, photos of her mother, every shred of truth she'd uncovered, and flew to Toronto under a legal alias, guided by the same private investigator her father once trusted. A man named Holt who didn't ask questions, only said, "If Lorne is alive, he's 10 steps ahead. Assume you're already being watched." And the moment she landed, she felt it. The eyes at the hotel lobby, the strange pause in her Uber app, the man across the cafe who read the same page of a newspaper for an hour. But she didn't flinch. She'd been underestimated her entire life, and this time she came armed not just with evidence, but with leverage. Because buried in Gregory's Project Raven folder was something even darker than her true paternity, a transaction between Lorne and Mercer Holdings from 2002. Signed in ink and blood, a blackmail deal to keep Vincent off FBI radar in exchange for silence about Elena's true fatherhood. Meaning the Mercer empire wasn't just built on fraud, it was built on deals with fugitives, murderers, and ghosts. And now the ghost wanted his share, because she received a message on her hotel mirror that night, written in fog though she hadn't showered yet: "You're not ready for me." And suddenly Holt was gone, his room left open, his gun missing. And Elena's chest tightened, not in fear but in rage. Because this was exactly what they did. They played psychological games, eroded your trust, tried to make you doubt your instincts until you were too frozen to act. But Elena wasn't that girl anymore. She traced the last ping of Holt's phone to an abandoned casino near the harbor, and when she entered, the walls were covered in printed photos, her childhood, the Mercer estate, Ivy crying at the will reading, her in law school, even her sleeping in the hotel the night before, photos no one should have unless they've been watching her for years. And on the table, a note written in gold ink: "Mercer's framed me. You burn them. We have the same enemy." But beneath it, another note scribbled in what looked like blood: "He lies. He kills his own. You're next." Elena felt the cold creep of panic for the first time since she left Sycamore Hill. Because this wasn't about revenge anymore, it was about survival, and the line between hunter and hunted was now so thin. She didn't know if she was still in control, or just the next move in someone else's endgame. Elena stood in the center of the cold, stone-walled room beneath the casino. The smell of damp wood and gasoline thickened the air, her heart pounding not from fear but from recognition, because the man who stepped out of the shadows, dressed in a charcoal coat with silver rings and eyes too much like her own, was not just Vincent Lorne. He was the missing half of her face, the ghost in every nightmare, the fire she never understood inside her, and when he looked at her, he didn't smile. He valued her like a weapon he once forged and abandoned, and said, "So this is what?" "My blood grew into efficient, merciless, elegant. I'm proud. Your mother would have hated it." And in that moment, Elena realized the final truth. Her mother hadn't just run from him out of fear. She had run to save Elena from becoming him, and yet here she was wearing a black coat, carrying evidence that could bring down governments. standing in a room lined with silent deaths and ruined men. Vincent offered her a deal, the last one he ever planned to make. Join me. I'll give you the rest of what Mercer never did. Power, legacy, control of everything. No lies. And on the table, he laid out a blueprint of offshore accounts, media control networks, and even Mercer-connected senators. All within her reach, all accessible by pressing one button on the tablet he slid across to her, but beside. The tablet was a second item. Holt's dog tags soaked in blood, his body never found. And in that moment, Elena didn't just see an empire, she saw herself in 20 years. Standing in that same coat in another cold room, trying to lure a daughter she didn't raise into a deal soaked in blood. Her voice didn't shake when she replied, "I'm not like you." But Vincent laughed, low and amused. "Oh, but you are. The moment you exposed the Mercers, you proved it." And maybe he was right. Maybe vengeance lived in her DNA, like a curse, but unlike him, she hadn't killed to hide the truth, she'd exposed it to burn the disease from its roots. And as she reached for the tablet, Vincent smirked, thinking he'd won it till she placed it back on the table and slid across a tiny audio recorder. The red lights still blinking, every word recorded, every threat, every plan. "That's not a deal," Elena said. "That's a confession." And before he could move, the doors burst open, Interpol agents flooded in. And Vincent mourned dead on paper, king in shadow was taken down by the daughter he never got to shape. Weeks later, as the Mercer estate was auctioned off, the headlines read, "Heiress Elena Mercer exposes 2 criminal dynasties," but she didn't care about headlines. She moved into a quiet cottage in Vermont, gave her mother a proper grave with her real name engraved, and each morning she drank her coffee not in luxury but in peace. The world called her powerful, dangerous, unstoppable, but she never chased power. She chased truth and found it buried in blood and lies. Now she buried the past, not to forget it, but to remind herself that even when blood is betrayal, legacy can still be rewritten by the one they tried hardest to erase.